how well.
All right. Thank you again, Ronan and Richard, for being on the show. Guys, I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to have you both on. Again, as we all know, Richard is a returning special guest, and Ronan is a first guest individual. And again, we are so excited and happy to meet with you, talk to you about your experiences and your company. I'm thrilled.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to meet you guys. Thanks for reaching out. I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with both of you.
Pleasure to be here again, Jacob. Thank you.
So, Ronan, right off the bat, man, how does an individual have an interest in law, goes to law school, but then gets into the psychedelic field? Would you care to explain that to us?
Yeah, it's a function of knowing oneself and just taking opportunities as they emerge. So I'll try to be concise, although I'm very rarely concise with this story. I went to business school in undergrad, decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. I had that in my head from being a kid. Terrible decision. It's one of those things that when you're a Jewish kid growing up and you tell your mom you want to be a lawyer, they never let you forget it. And so I finished undergrad. I knew I didn't want to work because working seemed like a fool's errand at the time. So I went to law school, got to law school. First day I got to law school, I looked around and I'm like, these are not my people. That's not to say I don't have wonderful friends from law school. I do, but I realized that it was not the path I was meant for. Notwithstanding, I got sucked into the vortex of corporate law. It paid really well. They treat you really nicely. And I showed up to work at Blake's, which is a big Bay Street firm in Toronto. And I despised my life. It was just miserable. I've never been diagnosed as being depressed, but I'm pretty sure that between kind of October and January of, I guess it's 2014, I was depressed. I hated my life. I was working in a restructuring insolvency group in an office with no windows in the middle of winter and just hated my life. I did have probably my first psychedelic realization, even though it wasn't a psychedelic experience. And on, I think, January 2nd of the next year, right before I had to go back to work after Christmas break, where I realized that achieving your goals is less important than feeling like you're making progress towards your goals. And so I woke up the next day, I went to work, even though I hated being there, and I started doing all the things or trying to make progress to the things I really wanted to do. So I reached out to everybody I knew to see if I could start a band again, because I played in a band in high school. And I started applying to every friggin' job I could apply to try and get out of the practice of law. But one of the things that happened when I was at Blake's was we were running an event as articling students to raise money for the United Way. And I had sent out an email to the entire firm promoting one of the things we were doing. It was a articling students shoe shine. And everyone had these ambitions for these big complex advertisements and all that kind of stuff that we're going to email out. And I just sent an email, very simple. It said, it was done in a competition with the first year associates. So it said, first year associates are dull. Don't let your shoes be articling students shoe shine. And that's all it said. And the response from all the lawyers was just overwhelming because they had never seen anything so creative, apparently. And one lawyer actually reached out and he said, "Are you too creative to be a lawyer?" And that was kind of the impetus I needed to be like, yes, I am too creative to be a lawyer. So I spent years trying to get out of the practice of law. It took a long time. Eventually left Blake's to go to a pharma company just because there's an opportunity to get out. As a junior lawyer, there aren't a lot of legal jobs available for you. From there, I worked at CTV Globe Media, which owns MTV Canada and Much Music. And that was super cool because even though I never got to start that band I set out to on that January 2nd of that year, I got to hang out in the music industry, which was super cool. And that's where I started learning a lot about digital technology and law and all that kind of stuff. Eventually went to work at an online dating company of somewhat ill repute, and then left that after a little while to become an entrepreneur, to do whatever. So I had a good friend who ran a dev agency, and it was 2010 or so when it was app startup world. Everyone was doing an app and raising tons of money. So we were going to do an app and raise tons of money, and the rest was going to be history. Learned a lot of hard lessons about trying to start a business at that time. Didn't get anything off the ground, but a friend of mine reached out and said he had a friend who was looking to open a cash for gold business in Toronto, and he was looking to partner. And I was like, ew, cash for gold. Why would anyone want to get involved in that business? But having nothing else to do, I was like, okay, let's do it. And so we opened up a cash for gold business. And so, this is what I called my descent into hell. So I was a corporate lawyer, which was bad. Then I was a pharma lawyer, and then I was a media lawyer, and then I was an online dating lawyer. And then I got into the cash for gold business, right? And I'm like, wow, I've really, really sullied my reputation. I really didn't care so much. But so I did that for a while, and then went back to just doing some freelance legal work with startups. Happened to meet some folks who were looking to start something new. And one of the ideas they had written down was, it was right around the time that the cannabis laws in Canada were changing. And so one of their ideas was to launch a marketplace for medical cannabis, kind of like Leafly in the US, if you're familiar with Leafly, but for Canada. And so I spoke to them. I was going to do some legal work for them. And they're thinking about this idea, and they're like, but it seems so sketchy. And I was like, guys, like, this is my descent into hell. Like, cannabis is like probably the best business opportunity. And reputationally, it's only going to be a step up for me, at this point. So I cajoled them. Slowly but surely, I got them on board. We joined forces. We opened up a clinics business called Canadian Cannabis Clinics, grew to become the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada. Really changed my perspective on drugs. I never cared if people smoked cannabis. I never really had any inclination or interest in it, but I certainly knew that war on drugs was a foolhardy policy objective. So anything I could do to try and undermine that, I was on board for. But it turns out cannabis is real medicine, and we helped hundreds of thousands of Canadians improve their lives through cannabis medicine by providing access through our clinics. And that really changed my perspective. So on drugs generally, I was pretty open-minded to agnostic to somewhat not for them, but not opposed to people using them, to really being like, oh, there's real potential here for good, whether it's just relaxation and ease or true medicine, didn't really matter. We sold that clinic's business to Aurora Cannabis. I'm actually still wearing an Aurora Cannabis shirt. And spent a couple of years there, had a crazy fun time. It was a good few years in the cannabis industry. Left Aurora, and it just so happened that the first conversation we had after we left was someone looking to raise money for a psychedelics business. This was in 2018. And she pointed to a couple of things. She pointed out to the MAPS being granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA for their phase 2 trial. She directed us to Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. And then the thing that was most important in my mind, even though from a business perspective, it's not that significant, at that time, there were 4 or 5 online stores openly selling psilocybin mushrooms in Canada, just selling them, no dark web, no nothing, just www. And at that moment, I realized that the global zeitgeist had changed, that psychedelics were coming, and we just had to run to catch up to where the wave was, because the wave was coming and it was going to be massive. And so spent some time researching, had my first psychedelic experience as part of that research. And Field Trip was born from there. So that's my kind of descent into hell, as I like to describe it. Although I think I'm on the other side now and think of it more angelic than devilish at this point.
I gotta ask you, were you ever nervous before your first time trying? Did you ever have any fears about it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, over the last 15 years or so, I developed like a pretty robust, certainly not the most engaged, but a pretty robust meditation practice. And I've had some pretty trippy meditations. And so I was just kind of like, oh, this is just going to be a super intense kind of trippy meditation. Okay. But what came out of the experience actually was, I found at one moment, like I felt a level of empathy for people that I'd never felt before. Like it was in a very specific context, but I was actually able to put myself in another person's shoes and say like, well, even though everything we did was like the mature, responsible thing to do, and therefore there's no real reason for them to be mad at us, I still understand emotionally why they're upset with us. And that was a really powerful insight. And then I was like, okay, yeah, there is magic in these mushrooms, so to speak. And so again, everything else is history from that point.
Kind of fascinating, especially when all of the research literature is pointing to decreased blood flow, excuse me, and the default mode network, especially between meditation and things like psilocybin or classic serotonergic classifications of drugs. And it's going to be interesting to see what Johns Hopkins comes out with when they publish their research later on this year about long-term meditators and religious practitioners. So with that said, can you briefly compare and contrast your meditation experience with your psychedelic journey, so to speak?
Yeah, I would say the visuals were probably pretty comparable in terms of I'm in deep meditation. What was different was the intensity of emotional awareness. So, not really having much guidance. I'm like, I'm going to listen to Pet Sounds by Beach Boys. And that was the album I put on for the soundtrack. And I was just amazing how intense and moving the music was, and not specific to the Beach Boys. I'm sure that's about true for anything. And so it really elucidated for me how meditation for me has been a much more cerebral experience, whereas the psychedelic experience is much more embodied and emotional for me. That was I think the biggest distinction for me.
Sure, sure. It just seems like, especially within the space, a lot of people use meditation to inform their psychedelic experience, to allow, that whole catchphrase of, instead of just being able to let go, instead of fighting against something, being able to tune in somatically to one's own personal experiences that they're feeling within the moment and allow to go into a deeper level. So with that being said, I know that your company is developing the molecule FT104. I would love for you to talk more about this. I find this endlessly fascinating because I think the chemistry is half of the magic when it comes down to it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll just clarify that it's no longer our company. So recently, Field Trip Health Limited was split into two companies: Field Trip Health and Wellness Limited, which operates the 12 Field Trip Health centers around the world, primarily delivering ketamine-assisted therapy, and Reunion Neuroscience, what was our drug development division. Same shareholders and all that kind of stuff, but now they're two separate companies. I don't work for Reunion anymore. I just work for Field Trip Health and Wellness. So just clarifying that for factual accuracy. Yeah, so, and it's also now RE104, Reunion 104. So again, just clearing up the nomenclature. What RE104 is a prodrug version of 4-HO-DIPT, which is a synthetic psychedelic that was developed by Sasha Shulgin. From the early days of our work in the psychedelic space, we recognize that long duration psychedelic experiences, while potentially very meaningful and generating great outcomes, are clinically difficult to administrate because it involves a lot of time, space, professional resources. And so we asked ourselves, can we find a shorter acting experience that generates the same outcomes? We were focused on serotonin. I can never pronounce it right.
So I'm the same way.
Yeah. So we were focused on 5-HT2A agonists, not focused on something like MDMA. And so Dr. Nathan Bryson, our chief science officer, went down a rabbit hole of all short-acting psychedelics and happened to land on 4-HO-DIPT. And it seemed like no one was studying 4-HO-DIPT, but if you look at it, you look at the subjective descriptions from Sasha Shulgin, he talks about how he doesn't think there's anything as intense over a short duration of experience as 4-HO-DIPT. And he also actually noted vis-a-vis 4-HO-DIPT that he thinks the shortness of experience, which is about half that of psilocybin, so call it an hour and a half to 2 hours as opposed to 4 to 6 hours, makes it really an interesting molecule from a medical perspective, from a therapeutic perspective, because it really truncates the time you have to spend in clinic. And so Nathan started looking into it. And what we found was that subjectively, the trip descriptions of 4-HO are substantially similar to psilocybin. Not entirely surprising, because if you look at what happens in the brain and the receptor binding, 4-HO-DIPT binds almost identically to the same receptors as psilocybin. So you've got something that looks and feels a lot like psilocybin, but half the duration. Sounds like a good equation for a great medicine for therapeutic purposes in a kind of more Western FDA context. The challenge with 4-HO-DIPT is that it's not terribly soluble. And now I'm getting to the lengths of my chemistry knowledge, so don't probe too much further than what I'm about to say. And it's unpredictable on a plasma level. But if you put it into a prodrug, you can really smooth out the plasma levels and ensure the onset by enhancing the solubility of it. And so RE104 is just a prodrug where we added a glutarate. So I guess the shorthand chemistry name for 4-HO-DIPT is isoprosin, and RE104 is isoprosin glutarate. So it's just a more stable form of 4-HO-DIPT, and therefore potentially, we've got IP around it, but we think a very persuasive medicine. So that was the thinking and where RE104 came from.
Ronan, I was just curious from like a biological aspect, how does one enhance a molecule? Like, what does that process look like?
That is starting to get out of my league.
Oh.
I know a little bit. One of the companies I was involved with before we started Field Trip was a company called Trait Biosciences. And what Trait has done, they've developed a number of technologies, but one of the technologies they've actually developed, actually using a very kind of similar kind of thought process, is truly water soluble cannabinoids. So cannabinoids, THC, CBD, they're fat soluble. That's why they get extracted into oils. And by virtue of being fat soluble, it's why edibles don't work as well. There's definitely a lot of chemistry involved in it and how your body metabolizes it, but because it's fat soluble, it takes a long time to be metabolized, and that's why you get that very delayed onset with edibles and all that kind of stuff. And it also makes it a harder ingredient to turn into beverages, because if it's fat soluble, it's like oil and vinegar, they separate. And so at Trait, the chief science officer came up with an idea to glycosylate cannabinoids, attaching basically a glucose molecule to a cannabinoid, which changes the chemical structure. And I don't know why or how this worked, from being fat soluble to water soluble. So all of a sudden you have an actually water soluble cannabinoid. You ingest it, your body cleaves the glucose molecule, and then it repopulates. So you're not changing the nature of the chemistry that happens in the body, but you're enabling it to go in a water soluble format. So you should, in theory, have earlier onsets, etc. Same kind of concept here, which is, I think, as you attach the glutarate molecule to it, I assume it's making it water soluble at this point. I don't actually know, but it's going to enhance the bioavailability somehow, and in a similar, approximately speaking, way.
Can we give a shout out to the late great Alexander Shulgin? He talked a little bit about that in his book PCAL, talking about trying to make things more bioavailable. And I think that's kind of important. I know that there's research being done trying to make DMT itself bioavailable, because I think it was him that always talked about how he would say that psilocybin is pretty much orally active DMT. So it's very structurally similar on the molecular scale. It's interesting because you talk about a shorter duration of action with RE104, and that really goes into the next concept that I really had for you in ways of reducing costs to the people that are trying to seek out treatment. I think that's kind of important, especially something that is being talked about heavily within the psychedelic space, is ensuring that people that do not have financial means get the same kind of access to these treatments as people with financial means. So it just doesn't look like a bunch of rich white people trying to seek out treatment and everybody else kind of gets left behind. Could you speak to that in your company?
Yeah, it's the one question that I really have a very good answer to be quite honest. It's a challenge. I mean, the truth is the reason that psychedelic therapies are so expensive, it's not the cost of drugs. Like psilocybin is not expensive. MDMA is not expensive. Ketamine certainly is not expensive. What is expensive is having people who have, many letters beside their names having to sit beside you for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, plus the prep time before and the integration work afterwards. That's what makes it really expensive. And so is there a solution to providing that at low cost? I don't know. Certainly a lot of people want to do the right thing, but again, therapists and doctors also need to pay their bills and feel like they're being fairly compensated. So we're trying at Field Trip. Again, we're in a startup stage where we're still burning cash. And so to provide discounted or free therapies to people is, well, very laudable and important, also creates a greater challenge for us to become a viable company, because we have to become a viable company to make it accessible to the people who can pay, who one way or another are going to be subsidizing the people who can't pay. Ideally, and I think importantly, and this is why, I think I'm personally a big advocate for both the medicalization as well as the legalization, is that if you provide medicalization in most countries, but for the United States, that means that most people are going to get access to it, because most countries, but for the United States, have some sort of nationalized healthcare. And when you look at the econometrics of psychedelic assisted therapies, at least the math, for example, that MAPS has done with MDMA assisted therapy, it's mind-boggling why any insurance program, or frankly, any employer, wouldn't provide these therapies, because the cost savings from increased productivity, a lot less absenteeism, generally happier, more productive employees, far outweigh whatever it's going to cost to put these people through these therapies. But it's going to take a while to get there. But as soon as insurance coverage comes around, it is probably the best thing we have to provide better access. It's not a complete solution, but it moves the needle more and more. And I know I'm probably a pariah that says this, but I also believe that if it's only rich white people who have access to psychedelic therapies because it's still overly expensive, that's still an okay outcome for me, because unlike Reaganomics, where I don't believe in the trickle-down effect fully from an economic perspective, I do believe in the trickle-down effect of people having their eyes open and their minds changed to become more compassionate, more concerned with the environment, all that kind of stuff. I get like some people's egos get inflated with psychedelic experiences, but done right, even if it's just rich white people, I do believe that will benefit everybody, even though that would not be my first course. It is still, for me, an acceptable course if that's the only option that remains available to people.
Ronan, do you feel like it has anything to do with like the negative stigma psychedelics still have in our society, and like a fear to it?
What does what have to do with the stigma?
Like, does it have any role in how insurance companies view like that, like type of treatments? Like, well, it's still, there's not a lot of research, even though it's made major improvements in research compared to the past. But again, there's still that negative stigma about what it actually is.
There's certainly that part of it. No doubt that's a factor. I think the factor though is, I mean, insurance companies are nothing if not data driven, right? And so it's just like the data, it's like the econometrics that MAPS provided is a theoretical analysis, right? They're not going to have real data until they put a whole bunch of people through MDMA assisted therapy and follow them for a while. But if they do follow them and it shows that MDMA assisted therapy is 10 times more cost effective than giving people antidepressants that don't work, that's going to change the equation. But for the time being, antidepressants are cheap, they're easy to prescribe, they help very few people, but they do help some. And so it's just easier for insurance companies to be like, this is the protocol, and some people aren't going to push further, some people are going to benefit, and then those that don't, will look at providing more expensive treatments, because there's no doubt this is going to be a more expensive treatment, at least in terms of the delivery of care, than most options for mental health right now.
Undoubtedly, you touch on the costs that go into these treatments, and it's absolutely crucial to have preparation, the experience, integration, have a team that is working with the client/patient to help them go through this. I often worry about the supply and demand issues that this tidal wave is getting ready to crash into the world of clinical mental health. So, for instance, Rick Doblin talks about how he wants to hire something like 10,000 clinicians to assist when this eventual wave hits next year for MDMA and then the following year for psilocybin. How is Field Trip? How are they equipped to deal with these supply and demand issues? How are you going to train that many people for your clinics?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, right now we've developed our own internal training, both for ketamine and psilocybin. And the truth is we probably won't be able to keep up to the coming wave. But from a business perspective, that's not necessarily the worst thing. That means that our clinics should be very busy and we're treating a lot of people, and hopefully by that point profitable, which gives us a lot more flexibility to open up training to more people, provide access to people who can't necessarily afford these services or care, and who don't otherwise have insurance. And then it's just going to be a kind of long game of training and providing appropriate. And there's no simple answer. I'm also a believer though, and I don't know the appropriate way. It's a function of how our society works. It's like, I don't think you need an MSW, or a PsyD or anything along these lines to be a very excellent integration. I'll call it partner. But from a regulatory perspective, if Ronan provides integration without any designation, and Richard does, and he does have an integration, and I do something wrong, well, it's the politician who's going to have some issue with it. And so I get it why they're trying to restrict it. I don't know the appropriate answer. I think probably training available to anybody is the right answer. So anyone who feels called to provide support can do so. Is that going to create unintended consequences? Absolutely. Is that unfortunate? Absolutely. Is it still the right answer? In my mind, I think so. But I don't know.
I got a little side note. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. So I've been doing some research on being certified. So have you guys ever heard of Innate Path, that company? Innate Path, I think they're out of Colorado.
No, I haven't heard that one.
So I'm doing some digging or whatever, and I applied for the training or just information. And they were just like, yeah, we're an 8-week program. It's in person, so you got to go there for 8 weeks. And the price is $2,800. So now that I'm thinking, okay, is that kind of realistic for a therapist to pay $2,800 to be certified?
The big problem that we're having within the space is that since it's not FDA regulated, that there is no real mandated training program. So you have a million training programs out there of all various costs. I mean, the MAPS training program is quite expensive. That also creates a lot of hurdles for clinicians that are trying to get into space, not to mention people that do not have the financial means, and that directly impacts the BIPOC community in of itself. Then you look at places like Psychedelics Today, which is one of the most premier podcasts on the planet, and you're looking at upwards of $10,000 for their training program. Now you look at the list of people that they have on their training program, you can see why that it's $10,000. I get it. But the problem is that people that are a clinician or a counselor that's in the space that just wants to jump in, is completely flooded. They just say, well, which one do I choose? And the problem is, until there's actual direction from the FDA and the DEA, I mean, who's to say which one is going to be the right path? Yeah. So saying that, Ronan, did you want to speak to how you guys have put together your training program? I would love to hear about this.
Sure. I mean, I can speak to it as best I can, but before I do that, I want to touch on one point, which is like, and here's one of the things, and that's why I've become so libertarian in my old age, the unintended consequences of like creating an FDA program. We see it all the time. For example, our therapists, we have some of the most qualified ketamine assisted therapy therapists in the world, both from their previous experience, but also working at Field Trip, taking more people through these experiences, generating incredible results. But because therapists are qualified by their colleges, and their colleges like to have their own fiefdoms, a therapist in New York can't deal with a person in California, right? So if we have a great therapist who wants to do a group session for people in California, they can't do it. But coaches who aren't governed by a college or any kind of regulatory body can do whatever the fuck they want. And so now there's an incentive to have less training so I can do whatever the hell I want, then be more trained and be subject to like all this oversight. And this is going to be one of the problems with the FDA, which is all of a sudden, there's going to be all these parameters of what you can and cannot do as a therapist. And what's going to happen is the people who are less qualified are going to be like, I'm going to stay underground, or I'm not going to do that qualification. And all of a sudden, like, it's just illogical. And so I don't have the perfect answer. I just came off a podcast from, I was on a podcast an hour ago. I think the answer is like, let's not try to overregulate it. Let's use design thinking and just kind of create an open platform and then learn and then respond, and then learn some more, and then respond, and hopefully get to the right answer. I don't know what the right answer is, but I know that if we try to regulate it in advance, it's probably going to lead to the wrong outcome. I see that in Canada with like all the cannabis stores, like all the freaking regulations about what they put on, who can be like, where you can have a cannabis store and what the design is, and you can't have anything, and you can't do anything but sell cannabis. And you know what people are doing? People are still buying from their dealers because it's not good enough. Like the going to a cannabis store is just not a good enough experience, and they get better stuff from their dealers. It's like, well, that was stupid, good intention, but you didn't think all the way through the consequences of it. And so anyway, that's a sidebar. For our training program was developed by our therapist. I can't speak to exactly what was involved with it, but it had input from both our clinicians, our physicians, our therapists. We also had input from underground therapists as well. So I really tried to get a variety of viewpoints, and it's experiential. So people go through the experience as well.
So Ronan, I got a question too, especially in the therapeutic setting, which I know you guys have a strong focus on. It's got to be a safe, caring environment. As we all know, there are a lot of ethical issues that can come up within that therapy session. For an example, we kind of thought of like individuals who have known to be taking MDMA throughout the therapeutic process have been known from an ethical point, like wanting to touch things, their experience, touch people, touch the therapist. Do you have particular guidelines to, again, maintain safety for the clinician and client? So again, there's no legal issues that come up, because there have been some horrendous stories, to be honest with you, about therapists sadly taking advantage of clients.
Yeah, I don't know the guidelines. I'm not too operationally involved. I think the current rule is like hand holding is permitted if the client specifically asks for it, but it's a little bit of a different equation with ketamine. Ketamine is a much more consuming experience, and so you're less likely to get up and want to touch stuff. You're pretty much going to stay put for most of your experience. When it comes to MDMA, that is certainly an issue we're going to have to navigate, and we'll probably start by just following best practices as promulgated by MAPS, and then evolve from there. But it's a problem for the future, not for today.
I know that you've talked about in previous podcasts that MAPS have kind of opened the door to allow you guys to kind of do what you were doing now. How do you guys differentiate yourselves between other companies, other psychedelic companies in the space? Full disclosure, I'm totally biased because I'm a huge Field Trip fanboy. But that aside, how do you differentiate between yourself and other companies?
To start, we focused on ketamine-assisted therapy, which is most companies out there providing ketamine infusions, not ketamine-assisted therapy. So the protocol that we use, we actually developed entirely internally. Not to say it's not easily copyable, it probably is. But what differentiates us is, I think, the focus on integration. I don't even think we do an adequate job of integration, and we do much more integration than anybody out there. I think that's one of the things. And then we were just having this conversation actually internally, which is, how does this not become a race to the bottom? Like, how do you not just compete on price? And I don't know if I'll call it a nice thing, but I'll use that word for now. The nice thing is like we can compete on outcomes, which is our data to date shows that on average, depression and anxiety scores for someone who completes the Field Trip protocol go from severe to mild, and those benefits last for 4 months. We're actually seeing it extends further than that now, and we'll be coming out with hopefully a paper that'll get published in a reputable journal soon enough that goes through the results. But it shows that, far and away, our results, as far as I know, are better than anything out there, bar none. I just got ripped on Twitter by some people who don't like me saying that, but it's true. It's like, as far as I'm aware, I don't know any current treatment offering that offers that. I know, TMS can offer good results, and same with like EMS. What's the acronym I'm looking for the
EMDR?
Yeah, no, not EMDR, but when they actually zap your brain with electricity.
ECT, maybe?
ECT, yeah. ECT can generate very long-lasting results, but as far as I know, nothing compares to us, and one is very pleasant, and the other one involves local anesthetic and being zapped by electricity. So, at the end of the day, we'll just continue to compete, saying, listen, we're generating better outcomes. Now, what I'm pushing for, and what you're going to see going forward with Field Trip, is I'm a big believer that psychedelic therapies are just the catalyst. They just open the door. Yes, during that experience, there can be a ton of healing that happens. But if you want to continue to have the benefits, the feeling great, the feeling fulfilled, the resilience, that's a lifestyle decision. That's not just psychedelic. Psychedelic starts you on the road, but you've got to continue on the road, which means continuing self-care, surrounding yourself with people who can have the conversations, doing the meditation, doing the breath work, eating right, all of this kind of stuff. If you just walk out the door and go back to your regular life, then you're going to fall back into old patterns. It's almost certain. And so one of the ways I want to differentiate Field Trip is I really, people think of us as a medical company. I really want to be thought of as a lifestyle company. I really like or hate CrossFit. They were really good at getting people to buy into the lifestyle of CrossFit. And even though you can get a lot of kind of injuries from CrossFit and all that kind of stuff, people who do CrossFit are probably a lot healthier than on average, right? Because they chose a lifestyle. They have their own dialect, they have their community, they have their practices, they have all this kind of stuff. And that's meaningful. Can we translate that to, again, mental health is not the right word. I hate that description of it, but it's probably the best we got right now. Can we translate that into like mental and emotional health and well-being, living the lifestyle that supports it? And that's where I think there's a great opportunity and where you'll see Field Trip innovating more and more in that respect.
Ronan, me and Richard have gone into previous conversations about like the beliefs people have prior to the psychedelic intervention. Because again, we would talk about like the negative stigma, especially back in the 60s, all their hippies, this and that. Well, again, there's also, we have to be aware there's a difference between how someone takes it, where a lot of individuals could be taking a high doses of psychedelics, which is not therapeutic appropriately, or not the appropriate level, where it all has to do with doing it with safe professionals and that individual's loving attention to get better prior to the process. I just feel is so powerful. And yeah.
Listen, I think that's hugely appropriate, but I also think we over demonize the 1960s. It's like, I did an interview with Dr. Julia Holland, who's like, the hippies were right on so many things. The hippies were right. And that was a bunch of 20-year-olds taking a shit ton of LSD at concerts, right? So we certainly magnify the potential risk for bad experiences and creating our own instances of trauma by doing it in uncontrolled environments. No doubt. But if we use the 60s as a measure, ignoring the political and social backlash that came from it, it still works pretty good, even if you're not doing it in the right conditions, right? So I think everybody needs to take a deep breath and say, like, the 60s weren't that bad. In fact, there was a lot of awesome things about what happened in the 60s. And like, I'm a big fan of, like, I've taken to this because I think it's an important conversation of trying to refurbish the reputation of Timothy Leary, right? The thing that made him the most dangerous man in America were the turn on, tune in, drop out statement, right? But if you think about that and you deconstruct it and you look at what he was trying to say, he was like, become self-aware, pay attention to the things that serve you, let go of the things that don't, right? That's basically what he was saying. That's exactly what Oprah Winfrey would say. So Timothy Leary wasn't wrong. He was just ahead of his time and probably could have used a little bit of a PR panache that he didn't have, but he wasn't wrong. He was pretty much spot on if you think about what we've learned since.
I like to think of Timothy Leary as one of the greatest comedians of all time. I think he just had a whole lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of his ideas, he was vilified and he was scapegoated. He became the poster boy of everything that was wrong. And if we all know from history that the whole war on drugs was just a racist attempt to stamp out not only an entire culture, entire races, ethnic groups, I mean, we can all agree. We all know that that was the reason. But to vilify Timothy Leary when he was, especially all the people that he was around, like Ram Dass, for instance. I mean, the entire generation of counselors and pioneers kind of evolved out of that crowd. I think it's fascinating. And I think it's also kind of ironic that you hear a lot of, Rick Strassman likes to talk about trying to go back to some of his meditation and yoga practitioners when he originally came out with his studies in DMT. And they all tried to shoo him away. And he was saying, but what are you talking about? You got interested in meditation and Buddhism and Buddhist psychology because of LSD. So now you kind of want to throw that away. So we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. I just think it's highly ironic that that's the kind of the way it goes, and it's probably the kind of way it went with an entire generation. So I'm trying to be mindful of your time, but I would love to know how your background has influenced your direction with psychedelics and the experiences that you may have had underneath these psychedelic states.
When you say my background, what do you mean by that?
Whether your culture, ethnicity, your identities,
Uh,
any of that, how does that influence, or how is that put on different colored glasses to allow you to interpret what psychedelics have taught or opened doors for you?
that's interesting. I've never looked at it through the lens of growing up as like a white Jewish man in North America. I've always like my learning, and again, this is going to come out in great detail actually as part of a documentary called Ordinary Trip that we're producing, where I put myself through these experiences. So I get a pretty deep insight into what drives me as I got that deep insight. You know, what's come out of a lot of my psychedelic experiences is a lot of who I am was really informed by like my younger years and like the people around you. Like my parents split up when I was very young. My dad was demonized. I didn't see him from the age of 7 until he passed away. My grandfather was very wealthy, but also very controlling, using money to control people. I went to school a year ahead of myself. So as part of my parents' divorce, we lived in Toronto, and then we moved to a city, Hamilton, which is about 45 minutes down the road. The school that my mom wanted me in Hamilton didn't have room in senior kindergarten, which was the appropriate age, but I was, I guess, a learning genius at the time because I could print my name and count to 10, which made me qualified to go into grade 1. And you can't see this right now from perspective, but like I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'8", I'm 145 pounds. I've always been the small guy, right? Starting a year ahead of myself and not being a big guy in the first place. I was always the small guy, got bullied in school. All of the effects of these experiences are starting to sort of like, you know, pull the rubber band ball apart, be like, oh, that's why I do this. You know, like one of the things I noticed is it was actually as part of making the documentary. Because I was both a producer and also a participant. So I was wearing 2 hats, but neither well. And I found at the beginning of it, there's tons of other stress at home and all that kind of stuff. But at the beginning of the experience, we went to a place called Holos in Costa Rica, where we had a psilocybin experience as well as a mescaline experience, San Pedro experience, which were both wonderful. But the first thing when I got there, I was like, people were asking me questions that I didn't know the answer to because I thought I was like part of the production team, which I was, but I wasn't. And I found myself in this experience of being 1 foot in, 1 foot out, right? 1 foot in the participant group and 1 foot out because I was like everybody else, but I wasn't. And what I realized is that I've experienced that my entire life, right? Like even within my friends group, I've always had 1 foot in, but I'm always the guy with 1 foot out, always slightly different, taking a slightly different path. And what came out of that, you know, the experience was, in part, that happens particularly in group dynamics with men, because the situation with my dad being bullied, I learned a deep distrust of men. And so, you know, in a group dynamic with men, and it's also because I always felt small, right? Like I've never felt like a big guy. I've never felt strong. I've never felt powerful. I've never felt like I had my own voice that could stand up for something because I was always the small guy. And my whole life has always been trying to overcompete to compensate to compensate for the fact that I'm not physically big and I never have been. And so I've always had to push myself harder and I always had to do more and work harder. And it's fucking exhausting. You know, it's truthfully exhausting living your life like that. And that's just always who I've been. I didn't know why or how that came about. It just always was, as long as I can remember. And so that's been really the profound stuff. So it's not necessarily, I'm sure a lot of that narrative has trickled down from years of persecution being Jewish and how the Jewish community has chosen to live and what they value and all that kind of stuff. But I've never parsed it out to that level. I've kind of kept it within 1 or 2 generations of my analysis.
You know, I know that there's a movement that's going on right now in the Jewish community, and I don't know if you're Reform, you just culturally identify as Jewish, but there's a whole movement to heal people in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. Do you have any opinion on that?
Um, I think it'd be great, and if psychedelics are the thing that gets people to put down their guards, then that's wonderful. I mean, I think the truth is like you're never going to unwind the past and get an accurate account of what happened. So I think everyone just needs to collectively decide to like put aside the harm and the trauma or move past it. And psychedelics can help that and just start from a path forward. I think that's the only way it gets resolved. So I do I think psychedelics can help with that? Yeah, absolutely. I think there has been some preliminary trials using ayahuasca and all that kind of stuff. But it's got to be part of a collective decision to say like past is past and we're just going to focus on the future. And that's, I think that's the more important decision. And that's really the conversation around all psychedelics, which is again, psychedelics are not the answer. They're the key that opens the door. And what you do when that door is open is what really matters.
Absolutely agree. I don't think psychedelics are a panacea for anything, but it definitely can help, right?
Well, I mean, people like to say it's not a panacea. I think it is a panacea. It's not
You
like
think so?
it's a panacea because like the doors that can be opened by it, I think if you go through them and do the work, can solve a lot of the world's issues. It's not psychedelics, but like to say they're not a panacea is not true. It's like trying to think of an analogy, but I think they can open the door. I think they can open the door. Everyone's got to choose to walk through it, and there's probably still many miles to walk after going through that door. But if that door doesn't get opened in the first place, that path isn't followed at all. So I think they are a panacea. They're just not a complete answer.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, before we wrap up, I'd love to, is there anything that you'd like to plug or talk about and let the listeners know about?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, obviously, everything at Field Trip. If you have any questions about Field Trip, feel free to reach out or our website, fieldtriphealth.com. Encourage everybody to download our app, which is currently called Trip, but it's going through a bit of a rebranding. But we've got amazing content and amazing music, and we're going to be investing heavily into enhancing that. So, for whatever wherever you are on your psychedelic journey, from just being curious to like actually going through it, there's great tools and resources in there. So I strongly encourage people to download that. On a personal level, I just published a book called The Trip Journal, which is kind of like the 5-minute journal for psychedelic integration, really just guided questions for reflection and writing it down as opposed to typing it into a keyboard or anything along those lines. And then the documentary, the website isn't up yet, but it should be up soon. It'll be ordinarytrip.com. Certainly encourage you to check that out. And yeah, those are the kind of big things in my horizons. If you want to follow Field Trip at Field Trip Health on any social, I'm Ronan D as in David Levy, Ronan D Levy on Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. And otherwise, just encourage people to reach out. Any questions? Always happy to have a dialogue.
So, and again, to all my listeners, I will make sure I put that information in my show notes, so he'll be one click away. Now, Ronan, as we do wrap things up, I have to ask, what are your future goals just with your career, life, your company? Is it to like gain more facilities or do more research? What would it be?
I mean, my goal for Field Trip has always been, and unfortunately, our direction of the actual execution of the company has been away from this, is like the more important thing is the conversation and setting the example and being the teacher in that respect. So my goal for the company is to evolve it from being a brick and mortar clinics business to really being a platform for anybody anywhere along their psychedelic journey to have a home, whether it's just to have a conversation, whether it's to have access to ketamine therapy at home or come into a clinic, or just have a great breathwork experience. It's like I want everybody to have a home within Field Trip. That's my ambition. Beyond that, personally, like retirement sounds really good right now. The last 3 or 4 years have been a real slog, and I don't think I'll retire forever, but it would be nice to spend more time with my kids without like the specter of like 1,000 emails percolating in my inbox, always kind of sitting on my shoulder. And so that's not coming anytime soon, but I definitely would cherish that because they grow up really fast. I know the trope is there, and it's a trope, but they grow up really, really fast. And I don't want to miss more of their lives than I have, or if I'm going to miss it, I want to be missing it because I'm doing really high impact, amazing stuff and not, accounting or meetings with like the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is all important, but in terms of what I cherish and value, the math always doesn't favor some of the work I have to go through.
Absolutely. Well, again, gentlemen, I thank you so much for being on the show. I feel like we did a lot of great things. We talked about a lot of great stuff. And it was an honor having both of you, Richard and Ronan, on my show today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here. It was great to chat with you, Jacob, Richard, you as well. Appreciated the questions, and anytime, always happy to continue the dialogue. So if you ever want to get on again and have a conversation, let's do it.
Oh, absolutely.
Love to.
Thank you.
I would love to. And if people don't already know, check out Ronan's podcast, Field Tripping. It is a blast. We didn't even get to talk about Juan Pablo that you had on the other day. That was a fantastic podcast. That's for a totally different conversation. But anyway.
For another time, yes, JP is amazing. Here's the thing. It's like with the exception of the trolls on Twitter who like to jump on everything you say, everybody in this industry really seems like genuinely good people trying to do genuinely good stuff. Even the trolls, I genuinely believe, are doing what they think is best. So
Ronan,
as long as
they're haters, right? Is that the term? Haters
gonna hate. Yeah.
Haters gonna hate. Yeah. Don't feed the trolls. Don't feed the trolls.
Yeah, that's it. We should have like a big cage with a sign on that. But that's the thing. It's like one of the things I really try to work towards is like your opinion is your opinion, and that's totally valid. And I don't need to cut you down or fight you on it. I don't mind asking questions and challenging some assumptions. But so many times people approach you, it's like there's no point in having a dialogue because they've had their mind made up. And so just keep an open mind. Everybody have an open mind and respect that. As far as I've met, everybody's doing their best to do what they believe is the right thing. And I know you can always use the analogy of Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's germane here. So let's just have a lot of respect for everybody who's trying to make a difference in the world.
Well, your company's doing a fantastic job. No wonder why people are going to hate on you. And I think a lot of people in the psychedelic space agree with that. So don't let them get them down. Don't let them get them down, because all they're trying to do is get a rise. That's why a lot of people just don't even get on Twitter or don't even read the comments. They just express and then just stay the hell away from all of the comments that come underneath it.
That's a fair point. Probably a good idea. I should adopt that outlook.
I don't blame you for not wanting to retire early, because it takes a strain on mental health for sure.
Yeah, it does. It does for sure.